They say a man disappears after divorce. Not physically, his body still goes to work, still pays bills, still breathes, but something inside him goes silent. You might see him at a cafe, scrolling absently through his phone, or standing at a red light lost in thought. He doesn't post about his life. He doesn't update his friends. And when someone asks, "How are you doing?" he just smiles faintly and says, "I'm fine." But that sentence often hides an entire world you never get to see. After the divorce, he becomes a ghost in his own story. Not because he wants to vanish, but because he no longer knows who he is when no one's watching. The man who once built his days around someone else's presence. Her laughter, her voice, her small routines now lives in an empty echo of what used to be home. The silence is not peaceful, it's deafening. Most people think divorce ends the story. Papers are signed, rings are removed, lives move on. But what they don't tell you is that for many men, divorce is not an ending, it's an identity collapse. The roles that once defined him, husband, protector, partner, are stripped away, leaving behind a raw question that few ever dare to face. Who am I now when no one needs me anymore? This isn't about pity, it's about psychology, about what happens in the invisible emotional life of men after separation. Studies show that men often take longer to recover emotionally from divorce than women. Not because they feel more pain, but because they've been trained to not show it. From childhood, many men are told to be strong, to move on, to stay busy. And so they do, but underneath that productivity hides a quiet grief that festers in the dark. What happens to that grief when it's never spoken? It turns inward. It becomes a silent architecture of loneliness, the kind that shapes how a man lives, works, and even loves again. This essay is not about blame. It's not about who was right or wrong. It's about understanding what really happens after the dust settles, when the court is quiet. The messages stop, and he's alone with his thoughts. It's about the secret life of a husband you never see anymore, the one who lives between memories and regrets. The one who doesn't talk about it, but still carries it everywhere he goes. Because sometimes what a man hides after a divorce isn't weakness, it's the last remnant of the love he didn't know how to show. There's a strange stillness in a man's life after divorce, a stillness that feels both empty and sacred. The first weeks are chaotic. Legal papers, shifting addresses, divided furniture, friends, choosing sides. But after the noise fades, what remains is silence. And that silence is where the real story begins. He wakes up one morning and realizes there's no one to make coffee for it. No quiet good morning. The house is colder, not because of the temperature, but because warmth used to be a person. Every object, a pillow, a mug, a photo, seems to carry her shadow, and that's when the invisible weight starts pressing down. For men, the aftermath of divorce often unfolds in private. Society tells them to move forward, to get back out there, to date again, to hit the gym, to prove that they're fine. But underneath those new routines, something deeper brews, a quiet confrontation with the self. Because in losing a marriage, a man often loses his reflection. The identity collapse. A marriage, for many men, becomes a mirror. It tells him who he is, a husband, a provider, a partner. When that mirror shatters, he doesn't just lose love, he loses definition. He can't see himself clearly anymore. Psychologists call this role loss, a condition where one essence of self was too tied to a single role, and when that role ends, the psyche goes into a kind of free fall. Women, on average, are socialized to maintain multiple emotional identities: daughter, friend, mother, sister, individual. But men, from a young age, are often taught to channel their emotional energy into one anchor, usually a purpose or a person. So when that anchor is gone, they drift. You'll see him working longer hours, taking on projects that don't matter, buying things he doesn't need. It's not vanity. It's distraction, a way to avoid the unbearable confrontation with himself. Because when the world grows quiet at night, and he sits alone in that apartment that used to echo with life, the silence asks questions he can't yet answer. What if I failed her? What if I wasn't enough? What if I'll never be loved again? The mask of strength. Men are not encouraged to break down publicly. Society romanticizes the image of the stoic survivor, the man who carries his pain like armor. But that armor comes at a cost. He doesn't tell his friends, he still looks at old messages. He doesn't mention that he sleeps on only one side of the bed because the other side feels sacred. He doesn't admit that every now and then he checks her social media. Not because he wants her back, but because he wants to make sure she is okay, or maybe to confirm that she is moved on, so he can finally stop waiting. This is the quiet contradiction of post-divorce masculinity. He must appear strong to survive, but that very strength keeps him from healing. The emotional economy of men. A strange thing happens when men lose emotional connection. They often turn to structure. Routine becomes therapy. Schedules become sedatives. The same breakfast, the same commute, the same playlist. Predictability replaces intimacy. But emotional needs don't vanish. They just hide. Men who once poured their affection into a partner now pour it into work, hobbies, or their children if they're allowed to stay close to them. For fathers, this is where the wound deepens. When divorce includes distance from their children, something primal breaks inside. Research from the American Journal of Men's Health reveals that divorced men have a significantly higher risk of depression and even mortality, not because of the loss of marriage itself, but because of the loss of daily purpose and human connection. The family was his emotional gravity. Without it, he floats. The unseen loneliness. Loneliness after divorce is not always visible. It hides behind functioning routines. He goes to work, smiles at colleagues, nods at neighbors, but inside there's a dull ache, a kind of emotional tinnitus that never stops. This loneliness is different from being alone. Being alone can be peaceful. Loneliness, on the other hand, is a hunger for presence, for someone to truly see him again. But he no longer knows how to ask for that. And this is where many men fall into quiet forms of despair. Not dramatic breakdowns, but subtle forms of fading. He stops reaching out, stops dreaming, stops trying. He tells himself it's maturity, when in truth, it's surrender. The woman's absence, rewritten in memory. Ironically, the woman he divorced often grows stronger while he becomes quieter. She rebuilds, reconnects, rediscovers herself. He, meanwhile, revisits the relationship in fragments, trying to make sense of what went wrong. He rewrites moments in his mind, asking if he could have said something different, done something more. But memory is a liar. It edits pain and highlights guilt. It convinces him that maybe he was the villain, or maybe he wasn't enough. And so, even years later, he might still be haunted, not by her presence, but by the story he tells himself about why she left. The new silence, after a while, he learns to coexist with the emptiness. The silence becomes familiar, almost comforting. He stops checking the phone. He stops expecting apologies. But the quiet life he leads now is not truly peace. It's an emotional exile disguised as calm. He goes to bed early, not because he's tired, but because it's easier than thinking. He avoids certain songs. He skips anniversaries. He learns to live with the ghosts of what if, and yet something begins to shift slowly. In the emptiness, he starts noticing small things again. The sound of rain, the comfort of solitude, the fact that life didn't end. It just changed form. This is the paradox of post-divorce manhood. Destruction becomes an invitation. For the first time in years, he's forced to meet himself, not the husband, not the protector, but the person underneath. That meeting is awkward, even painful, but it's also sacred. Because beneath the guilt, beneath the fear, there's still something alive, something waiting to be rediscovered. The invisible healing. Healing doesn't look like grand transformation. It looks like a man standing in front of a mirror, realizing he doesn't need to apologize for existing alone. It looks like cooking for one, but enjoying it. It looks like walking through a city at dusk with no destination, just breathing again. He learns that closure isn't a message from her, it's a decision inside him. That love doesn't disappear when it's unreturned. It transforms into wisdom. For some men, this realization takes months. For others, years. But the truth remains, the man you never see after the divorce doesn't vanish. He evolves in silence. He might still carry sadness, but now it has edges of gratitude. Gratitude for having loved, even if it ended. Gratitude for the quiet, because it taught him what words never could. And one day, if you saw him walking down the street, older, calmer, with eyes that carry stories he'll never tell, you'd understand that his disappearance wasn't escape. It was rebirth. Divorce does not merely end a relationship, it exposes the architecture of a person's inner life. When you strip away companionship, routine, and shared identity, what remains is the raw foundation of the self. For men, that foundation is often neglected, unexamined, or built upon borrowed expectations. To understand the secret life of a husband you never see, we must look beyond heartbreak and into the deeper mechanisms of male psychology, attachment, identity, silence, and meaning. 1. Attachment and emotional conditioning. From a psychological standpoint, men are often raised to equate love with duty and performance. They express affection not through words but through doing, fixing, providing, protecting. This performance of love becomes the language of worth. When a marriage ends, the performance ends too. And because his love was expressed through action, not introspection, the man finds himself unable to articulate what he feels. He doesn't have the vocabulary to describe loss in emotional terms, only in practical ones. It didn't work out. She moved on. Life happens. But beneath those neutral statements lies an emotional illiteracy that many men were never allowed to overcome. The absence of emotional fluency makes healing slow, because you cannot process what you cannot name. 2. The male experience of silence. Silence, for men, is both shield and prison. In many cultures, silence is taught as strength, the noble endurance of pain without complaint. Yet what begins as stoicism can quietly evolve into isolation. The post-divorce man stops talking not only because he doesn't want to seem weak, but because he fears misunderstanding it. He feels that no one, not even his closest friends, will truly grasp the depth of his loss without turning it into advice or pity. So he retreats into solitude. At first, it feels like survival. Eventually, it becomes identity. He convinces himself that solitude is his nature. But deep down, he is not protecting himself from the world, he's protecting the world from his vulnerability. 3. The search for meaning in the aftermath. Every ending secretly asks the same question. Why? Why did it fail? Why couldn't we fix it? Why does it still hurt? Men tend to answer these questions through rational analysis. They replay events logically, as if emotional pain were a puzzle that could be solved through reason. But human connection doesn't obey logic. It thrives in the irrational, in imperfections, timing, chemistry, and mystery. The post-divorce man tries to make sense of what was never meant to make sense. And when he fails, he turns inward, not to find blame, but to search for a pattern. Slowly, this introspection gives birth to an unexpected evolution. He begins to notice the difference between being loved and being understood. For perhaps the first time in his life, he realizes he never really knew himself outside the context of love. Now he must meet himself without an audience, without validation. That meeting is both terrifying and liberating. 4. Masculinity and emotional recovery. Modern masculinity often traps men in emotional contradictions. Society demands strength, but healing requires softness. It celebrates independence, but true growth requires connection. After divorce, men face an emotional paradox. To recover, they must dismantle the very armor that once kept them safe. They must learn to speak, to feel, to reach out. Therapists describe this process as reintegrating the self. The man must recover not only from loss, but from the cultural silence surrounding male pain. He must rebuild his identity on self-awareness, not social roles. Some find this transformation through therapy, others through solitude, spirituality, or art. But the pattern remains: pain, when faced honestly, becomes a teacher. The same silence that once isolated him now becomes the space in which he listens, not to others, but to himself. 5. Love reimagined. A curious transformation happens when the divorced man begins to heal. His definition of love changes. It's no longer possession or performance or responsibility. It becomes understanding. He learns that love doesn't have to mean merging lives. It can mean mutual freedom. He discovers that connection doesn't require control, and affection doesn't require certainty. He starts to value peace over passion, presence over promises. When he loves again, if he does, he will love differently. Slowly, quietly, without the desperate need to prove anything. Because he's already met the version of himself that survives alone, and that makes him capable of love without fear. 6. The invisible lesson. Every divorce leaves behind invisible lessons about communication, ego, timing, and human limitation. But the deepest lesson for men is this: that vulnerability is not the opposite of strength. It's the foundation of it. For too long, men have been conditioned to equate emotion with weakness, so they suppress rather than express. Yet what they discover in solitude is that true strength lies in facing pain without denial, in allowing sadness to teach empathy, in allowing regret to sharpen gratitude. The secret life of the husband you never see is not tragic, it's transformative. It's the slow, invisible redefinition of what it means to be a man in a world that rarely gives him permission to feel. In the end, divorce does not destroy him. It simply strips away the noise, leaving behind the essence of who he is or who he could become. And maybe that is the quiet gift hidden inside the heartbreak, that through loss, a man learns to live not for validation, but for truth. In the end, what happens after divorce? ISNT, the death of love. It is the quiet rebirth of identity. For years, the man who once built his life around someone else's needs must now learn to live in the unfamiliar rhythm of solitude. And though the world sees him as moved on, his journey is not about moving forward, it's about moving inward. When all the noise of a shared life fades, he's left with questions that only silence can answer. Who am I without the role I played? Who am I when I'm no longer needed? These questions are heavy, but they are also holy, because beneath them lies the truth that love, real love, was never meant to erase the self. It was meant to reveal it. The husband you never see is not lost. He is listening to the echoes of his mistakes, to the faint pulse of his resilience, to the soft voice that says, "You are still here." He learns that the absence of love does not mean the absence of meaning, that the emptiness left by another person can become the space in which he finally meets himself. And that maybe the end of us was never a failure, but an initiation into a deeper kind of understanding. Because when a man finally learns to sit alone without resentment, to remember without bitterness, and to hope without desperation, that's when he truly heals. That's when he stops chasing the woman who left and starts rebuilding the man who stayed. In time, he may love again, but that love will be quieter, wiser, freer. It will not come from fear of being alone, but from peace with solitude. And when someone asks him about his past, about the marriage that ended, the woman who's gone, he won't speak with pain or regret. He'll simply smile and say, "She was part of my becoming." Because that's the secret no one tells you. Divorce doesn't break a man, it unmasks him. And sometimes, losing everything you thought defined you is the only way to finally discover who you are.